Welcome to Cosmic Interviews. I'm your host, Rick Levine, and I have the honor, the privilege, the fun of being here today with Sam Reynolds. Samuel Reynolds is an astrologer. I wanted to say is a New York astrologer or New York, New Jersey astrologer, but you know, you can take, look, I'm a Bronx boy. You can take the boy out of the Bronx, but you can't take the Bronx out of the boy.
That's true.
Anyhow, Sam, welcome to Cosmic Interviews. It's a pleasure to see you, to catch up with you. Haven't chatted in a while, and congratulations on your move from the Northeast to New Mexico.
To the Southwest. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to be with you.
Cool. So one of the first things that almost every astrology interview program begins with is, so how'd you get into astrology?
Right.
I don't care. I actually know your story a bit, but what I'm really interested in is once you got the astrology bug, how did that impact your journey in life? I mean, I know for you, there's some special, what's the right word? Pieces of that puzzle. But how has your astrology journey taken you in a place in your life that you never really thought you might go? And it's been what, 20, how long have you been into
30 years.
How long?
30.
You don't look old enough.
Thank you. So this is where I take a page from Michael Irwin, where he has a book, Astrology of the Heart. I know astrology has opened my heart, right? My understanding of people, my understanding of much of the world. I think, the biggest impact, especially talking to hundreds of people every year, you kind of can walk for, an hour, 30 minutes in their shoes, looking at a chart as a guide, talking with them, hearing their stories, hearing their understanding of life, even though, sometimes I talk a lot, sometimes they talk a little. It used to be early in my journey, I let them talk a lot more. But overall, it's been really understanding more about the human condition and how that is in my life. So I would say that's number one.
Got it.
Two, the impact in my life. I have a North Node in Aries, so in the second house. Regardless of whatever house system you want to use, whether it's quadrant based or whole sign or equal. And one of the things that it's also impacted is my ability to kind of earn my own living, right, on my own terms. And I'm very grateful for that, especially, in the last few years where things have turned a corner and been more successful for me. Yeah. So I think that's another way, so to give you a very concrete example, I moved to Santa Fe and my Sun and Neptune are conjoined to my midheaven, right? Now, if I didn't have a job as an astrologer, I think there would be reason for some measure of concern depending on the job I was going for, moving to some place I didn't know or didn't know anybody really that well, and looking, let's say, for a job. Having Neptune on the midheaven is like, that can get sketchy depending on the kind of work you do. Like if I'm oil, things related to Neptune.
Yeah, no. With the Sun Neptune on the midheaven, it's difficult to find a job as a high priest in a cult, or as a rock star. Both of those jobs are difficult to come to.
Right, exactly. So, but I didn't have to worry about that, right, in terms of that. So I could come here with some things, but yeah. So it highlights a different Neptune experience for me, and I knew I could have a different experience of Neptune here. Mm-hmm. So it's given me a certain understanding of how to navigate also through life.
Yeah.
And then I guess it's the people I've also encountered. I mean, there's a range of people. We know there's a range of people in the astrological world, but one of the things I can say, there aren't too many dumb people, right, in astrology. There's some, yeah, but most of the people I've met, even when I disagree with them, you know, they can articulate so much more. They bring so much more into their astrology than just astrology itself.
I remember Timothy Leary writing many, many, many years ago that the smartest bees, the most intelligent bees, are the ones that go farthest from the hive. Which always struck me. I don't have no idea whether it's true or not, but it makes sense. And in a way, what you're saying about the intellectual prowess of many people who are involved in astrology, in some ways, astrology is an intellectual pursuit. It's more than that, obviously, but it's a pursuit that brings us far away from the hive mind.
Correct. That's a brilliant way to put it. I mean, I think that's what I've appreciated, you know. I mean, I've been in the academic world, and there are just some people, it's like, well, you're just pretty good with books, and, you know, there's a way in which you can sound pretty. I mean, some of that also happens with astrologers, but especially when you talk about the consulting astrologer, it has to be a little more than that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, and I think that most, maybe many astrologers are not just interested in astrology as a business and or as a consulting or practical tool, that it becomes part of a larger cosmology that
correct.
Many people who may not be as I get that there's many types of intelligence, but may not be as curious, don't ever think about things like this. But, you know, you put a few astrologers together and the wide ranging conversations about, you know, about different topics and how astrology may or may not fit into them, to me is always fascinating.
Staggering.
And, yeah. And I totally agree with you. The astrology community, I've been in a number of different industries, and the smartest people that I know tend, or let me put it this way, that the astrology community / industry, if you want to call it that, has some of the smartest people that I've ever met.
Yep. So I would agree. So, I mean, this is how I would say, and it's an excellent question. I mean, that's really, you know, those 4 things I might focus on in terms of how it's impacted my life. And then there's, you know, different things in terms of relationships, not just in terms of being in the community, navigating relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, understanding, you know, I guess during a Mercury retrograde to know when you need to, you know, pause, you know, in terms of how you're communicating, you know, like, oh, to get on the phone, you know, things like that. So I'm very grateful.
So let me ask you another question along the similar line, but this has come up. It was brought up in a lecture at Norwalk that Ricky Williams did. And my question to you is, for you, is astrology a religion?
No.
I answer the same. Ricky Williams answers differently, and I respect his answer, just to be absolutely clear. But I do agree with you. Do you care to say anything more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, other than that, I'm a Muslim. But so I mean, I guess you could have, you know, 2 religions, ideally. But I don't see it as a religion because it doesn't. There's no necessary. I think one particular necessity of a religion is that there is a dogma, you know, a key set of beliefs. You know, whether we're talking about Buddhism, where there is no God,
and if you don't have those beliefs, then that religion doesn't work.
Right. You're not participating in that religion.
That's exactly the reason. I mean, there are others. It's a deeper discussion, but that's exactly the reason why I would jump to the answer no also, because chemistry works whether or not you believe in it. You know, you go through stuff at your Saturn return, or a Taurus rising is different than a Gemini rising, whether you believe in astrology or not. However, you're not saved unless you believe in Jesus, or, you know, or unless you accept a certain teacher or prophet, or, you know, or deliverer of the message. And yeah. So yeah, we agree.
Yeah, there's no, yeah, and I don't think there's any dogma, which I think is the principal piece that you need in, most of the religions, and I'm not just talking about the Abrahamic ones, in terms of there is a premise that you accept that there's a correlation between what happens above that's happening below, but that's just a matter of correlation. That's not saying like this is like, if you don't believe this, then you don't have some aspect of astrology.
Yeah,
So.
and interestingly enough, and I really do want to get off this topic, but it's such a fascinating topic that nowhere in the Catholic canons does any you can't find anything that says astrology doesn't work. It just says don't do it, and it says if you accept Jesus as your savior, then astrology doesn't matter, doesn't affect you. And oddly enough, in the Talmud, actually in the Midrash, which is a commentary on the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Torah or the Old Testament, there's a passage that basically addresses astrology, and it says that astrology is valid and works for everyone except for the Jews. It's the same thing. It's what Paul Tillich called ultimate concern. When we have something that we believe something so strong, gravity doesn't apply to me. I can float, kind of a thing.
Right.
Anyhow, thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a fascinating question. I mean, especially, it's a lot of my life has centered on religion.
Yeah. Shifting gears and it's just I'm going to open up a door to a topic that is just such a powerful and profound topic, and I'm absolutely honored to actually open this door with you, because I totally respect the work that you've done here. And here I'm obviously talking about diversity and the way that the astrology community has changed. I've been involved actively in the astrology community for about 30 years. I mean, as a participant in conferences and whatnot. In fact, this was my 31st NORWAC that I went to this year.
MashaAllah, that's wonderful.
But for the first, I would say 23, 24, maybe 25 years, the community was pretty static. There were changes that were that occurred because of some of the self-awareness that the community had. Two changes in particular. One was the gender inclusion, because, as I know, historically, some 70% or more of the attendees at an astrology conference would be female, and approximately 70% of the people lecturing on the podiums would be male. And this was absolutely objectified and managed by a number of the organizations over the period of the last, I don't know, decade and a half or so, where we have a fairly even split of male female from the podium, so to speak. The second was a movement that began, I'm also guessing, about 10 years ago, and that was the fear that the astrology community was growing older and older, and that there were no young people to replace, those who were, in my mind, who were old and dying off, realizing that I'm now one of them. And there was a tremendous concern amongst the organizations of how do we become more inclusive? How do we bring more young people into astrology? And from that was actually founded AYA, the Association for Young Astrologers. And whether it was AYA and or the industry's attention to this issue, or quite frankly, whether it was just a whole generation who came up on the internet who didn't give a rat's ass about conferences, who were turning out better astrologers than many of us were later in our years, just because they were overwhelmed with how much good information was available. I don't know cause and effect there, but I do know that we have a tremendous buzz of youth in the field. Yes. The third, and where I'm going with this, has to do with ethnic and or race divisiveness and or diversity, or exclusion, I should say. Talking as an old white guy, it's like often when there was a conference where there were one or two or three people who were Latinos, still just not much representation, but African descent, not much. There would be an occasional person who would float through and kind of, but that's totally changed. I mean, that has changed so overwhelmingly, maybe not as much as it still needs to, but it's definitely a different community than I grew up in. And I am so juiced. I am so thankful, not only to everyone who's involved in it, but to you in particular. Not that it all falls on you any more than I saved the industry by bringing in youth, but you certainly played a catalytic role on that. And I want to just take a moment and honor you and thank you for that. But I'm wondering if you could maybe address what I just addressed from your perspective of being first a quasi outsider, then a player, and then an instigator, and now to many a superhero.
All right, I should have wore the S, right? Oh,
Gymshark has an S in it.
Right. Well, I think I love your historical overlay, because I think that's important. I think it's important in understanding all the different ways in which astrology has struggled with diversity, and then how our society has been laying the groundwork by contention and by protest and by, different levels of struggle to make that happen. So let's go back just briefly, because I think it sets a precedent for understanding what's happening now. So one of the biggest shifts from the 60s to 70s, and then definitively in the 80s, as you mentioned, as I understand it in the astrological community, was the growing introduction of women coming into the community, right? Because one of the things to recognize, because, now, because we're reworking history, a lot of people have a revisionist sense of history with astrology. It's like, it's a very feminine discipline. I'm like, yeah, except for 2,000 years of its history was pretty much all male.
Yeah, it was. Right? It was basically, I like to make sure that people understand that astrology was largely written by guys for guys, and typically by guys who were serving guys who were in power.
Boom.
Boom. That's it. Absolutely.
So,
you get a description of a Leo. You're not getting a description of a Leo. You're getting a description of a male boastful Leo.
I'm doing a close reading with my assistant of Abu Mashar's, one of his books, and especially related to Fedaria, definitively writing for men, because all he talks about is like, and your woman would die in childbirth, or this woman will do this, and this woman, you'll experience ruin by women. It's just like, do you like women? Like, what's going on with you? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what Abu Mashar's relationship was with, but the definitive notion of it is just what you said. Now, what changed, and then becomes a precedent for what we're seeing even changing in the community now, is that a growing number of women, initially white women, and then now is coming with other different diversity aspects of women, moved into more arenas that have been closed to them. And also having disposable income, getting from under their husband's shadows, or the expectation or the attachment related to their shadows. Many women also coming to earn their own money. There was a good pool of astrologers, I think more so in the 80s, where, the husbands had corporate jobs, and it was really the wives who were able to come to conferences, who, then because they had an interest in it. But that's changing now. It's been changing for a while, where now there are more women who are involved in astrology as their main source of income, often independent from their husbands or partners. And that's an economic shift. Now, why that's important is, I think there's been generations, because take, for instance, I'm not the first iteration of someone who's kind of been making some forays into astrology. There's Ronald Tiggle, who was on the ESAR board. There's Basil Farrington. There's James Coleman, right? These are the people who, even when I was just coming on the scene, were someone out there. Ronald wasn't there out there as much, but this is someone I've learned about later.
Yeah.
But the idea of the quote unquote Black astrologer kind of making a foray, whether Black, male, or woman, has been generations in the making. And that's significant because, 3-4 generations ago, not just enslavement, we didn't have the disposable income to be invested in buying astrology books, much less doing astrology professionally.
Well, 3 or 4 generations ago, let's be clear, there were no astrology books except maybe a dozen that anyone could buy. But yes, what you're saying
Right.
is very valid.
So, so there's an economic development that, and I think people need to be aware of that because, especially people of color, realizing that we didn't always have that disposable income or even felt comfortable. There's also the religious factor. There's a lot of, especially in the African American community. It's like whether you're talking about Islam or whether you're talking about Christianity, it's kind of like you don't do that. That's the devil's work. So that's been that barrier. So there have been things that have been growing and breaking open that paves a new path in the astrological world that we can see related to women. We also see that related to sexual diversity, in terms of the number of...
Which I didn't mention early on, but to me, that is absolutely part of the changing fabric again, which I'm just absolutely thrilled about how responsive and open and inviting. Yeah, there may be individual instances of problems that people have had, but in the past few years, it's just a radical opening and shift that is very exciting.
Absolutely. And it's bringing, different questions in terms of how we talk about the planets, engender them, how we talk about heteronormative expectations. Just I was talking to a student just a few hours ago, and she was talking about, in horary, then you might be able to use the sun as a significator as a natural significator for a partner, and Venus for a woman. I'm like, well, I don't know if that always works, right? Because that's going to be different in different, non-heteronormative relationships.
Yep.
Right. It could be that if you're a lesbian and you're an AG, quote unquote aggressive type of lesbian, and you have more feminine partner, it may be that partner is one is the sun and the other person is Venus. So these things become skewed, queried in very different ways as we start talking about the proliferation of diversity in astrology. And, there's a lot of shock to the system that we are recognizing within the community. And one of the things that makes me sad, believe it or not, even though, yes, I can be kind of, iconoclastic, I can be in your face, that Mars and Capricorn is like, oh, you want to do battle? All right. It's like, gives me joy. But believe it or not, I do have a Venus in Libra. So it's like, that's, believe it or not, more last resort for me. Where I feel like there's no other option. I wish we could have more dialogue, because it's not that I'm completely adverse to the conservative argument. I just think the conservative argument knee jerks and reacts out of fear rather than asking more pressing questions.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, we can just stick to astrology. We don't have to get into politics. It's kind of like, yeah, but if you start messing with gender of things, and we're talking about Ptolemaic thought, and we're talking about Socratic thought and Platonic principles, what do we have? I think that's a good question related to like how we keep the integrity of the system. Now, that doesn't mean we stop there, but I think it's good to ask.
No, but the issues that it brings up is important. One of the things that I like to have my students think about when studying planetary dignity is showing a clip that's a National Geographic clip of a lioness, a mother lioness, protecting her 3 cubs. You don't want to fuck with her. And to say that Mars, is not okay in Cancer. And I know it's not that simple, but again, this comes of so much of our stuff has this invisible, systemic, patriarchal, if you will, or colonial patriarchal overtone that's invisible, where we get a planet like Mars that is exalted in Capricorn, but in its fall in Cancer, and the reasons are not necessarily always applicable in modern day life.
Correct.
Again, I'm not saying any of this to diss Hellenistic astrology. I'm just saying
No, not at all. In fact, one of the charts I love to teach, and I guess I'm giving it away, so I don't know who's going to be listening to this. I love to teach this chart. I usually teach it blind first. Is Charles Darwin's chart. And why I love to teach it, because when we're talking about
the same as Abraham Lincoln's.
Right, exactly. And but I'm focusing on Darwin because we have I really have a lot of respect for Darwin, and it doesn't mean I don't have any respect for Lincoln, but it's different. It's much more intimate, different history related to that. But he has 5 out of 7 planets of traditional planets in what I call a foobar position, a fucked up beyond recognition, right? Position, right? He has the sun in Aquarius, his moon in Capricorn, he has Mars in Libra, he has Venus in Aries, and he has Mercury in Pisces, right? 5 fucked up planets, right? Does that mean he was fucked up? No, right? So what does it illustrate? What it illustrates is that a planet in its debility, whether it's in its fall, in somehow has a different sense of belonging to the point where it may not feel like it belongs. And that, like the bee going to the farthest regions, right? Being the smartest bee, that prompts innovation, that prompts change. Now, as you're experiencing that as a person, that feels really hard. And, you might feel some measure of isolation or, some ways in which you are maligned in the community in which you function. But that also can become your strength, just like that Mars in Cancer. And like you said, it could become the chief protector. One example of that is Michael Phelps has won more gold medals than anyone in recorded history of Olympians, right?
Yeah.
And you might think like, well, he must have an exalted Mars, right? No, he has Mars in Cancer, right? Which fits for a swimmer.
That's right. He's aggressive in water. But just as an aside, he is an alien. We just, he is a fish.
Right. I mean, and I think that's also a statement related. I mean, like, I know you're half joking, which is cool. I mean, because you see his feet, you're going like, he's half. Like, right. You just look at his feet, Mark's feet, and you go like, I don't know. But here's the thing, like that's why I said there's a different sense of belonging with that Mars in Cancer, and he found a way by which he could make himself belong. Yeah. He still struggles with that, but that's the thing.
I want to get to a specific astrology thing in a moment, but I have one other thing that I'd like to get to on the way to that. And that is, although I'm a person who, this partly is my Cancer moon, I'm on social media, I do my posts and all of that. I often read and don't get involved in posts.
You're smart.
Cancer moon. Well, it's partly because I don't have time to then keep up with what I start. And so it's not fair to other people. And it just creates situations that I find frustrating because I'll post something and I don't get back to it. But I know that you had a recent go around that had a little bit of history that I did read and was very interested in. And actually, I think I sat on my hands so I didn't jump in. But I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that, because again, these are important things that, people often think astrology, learn the planet signs, houses, aspects, do charts. It's not that. It's be a human being and show up in your community and live, participate. And so again, you do that, and thank you. But if you could share that with us, that would be great.
Sure. So I made a Facebook post responding to an astrologer who made a blog post on his own page about his concerns, and I'll reveal his name and everything in a second. And when I say his name, it's more so partly for transparency. And then also, I don't think this is someone who's trying to hide.
No, if you post something on social media, you're not
right. Or you make a blog post. It's not like if we had a conversation, it'd be a different issue. But
I agree.
So he made a blog post where he was essentially talking about how words, particular things, have lost their meaning because there is the aggressive mounting of an agenda that he identifies as leftist and progressive, and that it's uprooting, what can be the best of astrology, and what really, it just seems to, really be not just fracturing the community, but even fracturing a sense of what he has said in different permutations of what really is true. And
what you're referring to specifically is use of personal pronouns.
Yeah. Well, he also talked about race. and racism.
Race and racism, and I think he used what I consider
what racism means in that, and he also talked about
colors.
Yes,
he talked
colors.
about red and blue, and that meaning red can mean blue,
and which in terms of and it's not just on the spectrum of what in terms of trans, because some people just say you're transphobic. That may be true about him, but apart from labels, what he really takes issue with is kind of having a spectrum of gender identification, right? Where, especially whether we're talking about use of pronouns or how someone identifies, by virtue of being quote unquote born cis male, but then comes to identify as female or woman. So he takes issues with all those different things. And this is not the first time or the first post he's made. So just to go back a little bit, his name is Charlie Aubert, and you can't see it, but I have his books. So it's not like I don't know of him. And when I say I have his books, I think I have 4 of his books, right? So I've given him indirectly money. So this is someone who I've had a vested interest in.
Yeah.
So when I say I have his books, I've read all of them. So it's not like, I have his books, I'm going to read them one day. I've read his books. Anyway, I've seen him over the last year, maybe the last 2 years, go progressively more toward the right and making some of the same points that many on the right do. Now, let me just say something about my own politics. Even though I consider myself a progressive, a quote unquote leftist, I do not malign anyone for their politics, right? I may differ with you, but you have the right in my book to be on the right, right? You have the right to feel, and to love Trump. I don't care, right? May not be my preference, and I have people in my life who love Trump, who saw him as a good president, right? And thought he did great things. There are people who I love like that. So it's not like, I think that's not where I'm coming from.
So I misread the fact that you were wearing a red shirt.
Right? Like, go Trump. No. But so it wasn't on that level of personality or personhood. What I took issue with is, at January 6th, when we had really the attempt to overthrow the government, essentially a coup. This person, Charlie Aubert, had been talking about how Black Lives Matter was unruly and kind of usurping the government and all that. That's a common talking point on the right. And I won't say I agree with it. Obviously, I don't. But I understand that perspective if you look at life a particular way. Okay. Yeah. So I just wrote him on his page because we were connected on Facebook. And I said, well, are you going to say anything about January 6th? These people literally, cops got killed. You can't look at Black Lives Matter events and be like, a cop got killed, right? So his answer was to block me. So I was like, oh, okay. So that's, there's no real dialogue. So when I saw this blog post, I actually was like, okay, I'm not going to deal with it. But then I saw a colleague of ours, Kim Bowser, reply on it. And then that's when I replied too. And then I made a post on my Facebook page where I said, essentially, and this is what I mean, a long-winded way of saying it, I don't begrudge people who are on the right in the astrological community talking about the changes happening in the community. But I have a question. My question, maybe I'm speaking with my Mars and Capricorn here, I don't know, but what are you going to do about it? And what does that mean? Right? When I say, what are you going to do about it? Does that mean then you're going to be, is the logical recourse that you're going to oppose diversity programs? And for what? What are you fighting for? Because I know what I'm fighting for. I know what we've been commissioned to do in relation to diversity, which is to open more possibilities. Do you want to narrow them? Why? So, and that is, I kind of openly admit it.
Freud would call it infantile regression. I hate to say, but
Yeah.
It's like things were better then, whether they were or not. And that's what we want to do. We want to, make it as good as it was,
And was it really that good? And that's kind of
it wasn't necessarily that good. Yeah.
And that's kind of the question that comes up.
But
like,
one of the things I appreciate about what I hear you saying, reading between the lines, I say it this way, and during this year or two of Saturn squaring Uranus, is you can't have change unless you have structure, and you can't have structure unless it's willing to change. In other words, they're although like you, I definitely have a point of view and perspective. And actually, like you, I can respect some people. I say some people, I can respect the people who think very differently than I do if they can defend it, even though I disagree with them. On the other hand, it's hard for me to respect those people on either side who say this is the only possible. It gets back to dogmatism in a way or something. Is that too much Uranus without some Saturn? Structures fall apart. Too much Saturn without some Uranus, then the structures get so heavy they die under their own weight, under their own gravity. You need the interplay.
Exactly. And I think, interplay is a good word and good segue to what I really think should happen, which is dialogue.
Yeah.
Absolutely. do we want to have a discussion about what this means? And it seems that it either comes with right or wrong. And this goes into like the concern related to cancel culture. And I want to talk a little bit about that because you mentioned about social media. I don't believe cancel culture exists, right? What I think happens is this. What has happened, speaking of like, movements of history, economic shifts and things like that, social media has become an equalizer for people who have long been marginalized and unable to be heard, who could not be heard through quote unquote mainstream media. They were never going to get an audience to be able to address particular things that someone has said, all these particular things. And then that also goes along with people who also want to talk about political correctness. Well, people also bemoan political correctness, but they don't realize some measure of it is dealing with off-color language that really didn't support anybody. So now, a woman doesn't have to necessarily worry as much. Still, sometimes it happens to be in a room full of men in a corporate setting and be like, well, as long as the broads are here, we're going to. They don't have to hear that kind of language, or the N word casually thrown out, or the F word casually thrown around. These are things that really hurt people historically, marginalized people historically. So these same people have found voices or a voice through social media and are letting themselves be known. So people say like, well, they just cancel people and then, you can't have this dialogue. Well, some measure of that, there is a mob mentality, and I think there is definitely some aspects of that does happen. I will openly admit that there is sometimes where there's this hive, swarm effect that can happen. I've been a victim of it, right? I've seen others victimized by it, and it's awful.
Yeah.
But understand that this is one particular moment in history where people who haven't had that power suddenly feel it and they're angry. Yeah. And I think that's important to acknowledge the anger rather than like, well, why are you angry? Because of this, it's, America's great. Well, they don't feel that and they feel a certain way about it. And that particular feeling is not respected. So that's one, I would say to my colleagues and peers, like, before you have a knee-jerk reaction, where do you think this is coming from? Then I think we can build an arc toward dialogue where we can start to hear each other. Like, well, my concern is this, and this related to language. But that's not what's expressed. It's kind of like, no, you're wrong. And here's why, because words matter. And I know what racism is. And so you have, just to be blunt, old white men who can tell me like what racism is, and I have 2 degrees in African American studies, and I'm black.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, you're black?
No. I know, right? I'm kind of
No
reddish,
way.
but that's what I mean. It's kind of like, well, what do you think? You know, what gives you this level of authority that you can tell me what racism is or isn't?
Yeah.
Because what you just can look at the dictionary, and that's the only way by which we can look at it. I can also look up another word, drapetomania, which is a classical word from the 19th century, which was a condition of an enslaved person who wanted to be free. That's a literal word. It's in the dictionary.
Tell me the word again.
Drapetomania.
Spell or get close.
Trapemania.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Yeah.
It was a word coined in the 19th century for that particular condition by a southern psychologist.
Right. Right. Well, I'm sure we can find a cure for that.
Right. So I mean, so when we talk about the nature of words and then seeing just because they're in a dictionary as if things are set in tradition, are immutable.
Yeah.
Rather than seeing them as contestable. Now, again, there's two sides to it. There's at least one side that's like, oh, that's just BS and I hate it, blah, blah, blah. And often it comes with very strong emotion because, again, there's been a lot of marginalization. Then there's another side that has been more beholden to the past, you know, learn things a particular way, but feels defensive. The only way we're going to get through that is kind of get from just taking always the offense, the defense, and saying, like, where can we actually just get off the fence and talk?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And this person didn't seem like he was interested in dialogue.
No.
So, you know, I let my Mars and Capricorn just kind of like, all right, you know, I'm doing knives here, or whatever, swords, whatever. Like, then I'm just going to flay.
Good. Good. Well, thank you for sharing that. And this conversation is so rich. It's so deep. It's endless because it's so much a statement of the dynamism of these times. And when I say these times, I mean 2020, 2021, but I also mean the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century. You know, from a larger historical perspective, if we as a species survive, we will look back at this few hundred years and go, holy smokes, we as a civilization grew up and got it. Or we as a civilization, not even as a civilization, as a species, didn't get it and fucked up forever. I mean, it's ultimately the last book Buckminster Fuller wrote before he died was a book called Utopia or Oblivion. And he basically said that over the near foreseeable future, there would be increasing waves of expression around the planet that would be waves of events that would either be difficult, tragic, problematic, or waves of ecstasy and breakthrough, and that these waves would get larger and larger on both sides until one wave finally came through, and that there was no middle ground. We would either end up, you know, with utopia or oblivion. Now, whether or not that's true or not, it's a statement of how dynamic these times are, and how these multiple points of view are so important to understand, not from a standpoint of, well, I'm obviously right, because look, let's face it, I am. But so is someone else. And so we have a problem. And the problem isn't to decide who's right. The problem is to decide, how do we move to some place that's a goal for both of us, even if we feel like we don't have common ground.
Correct. Right.
So I appreciate this conversation. Again, I appreciate your role in it.
Thank you.
And
yeah,
I'd like to spend more time here, but I do want to touch on something astrological before
okay.
We can talk for a long time. I get that. Did you have anything that you needed to say to conclude that? Or, I mean, are we good there? Or if,
No, I think, yeah, that was a good ending point in terms of that particular piece.
Okay. So totally shifting gears for a second. What I want to know is that when you look at a client chart, whether it's a client you've prepared for, or whether you're at some situation and someone goes, here's my chart. You know, you have a chart in front of you. Where does Sam Reynolds go? What's your, what do you want to do in a consultation? And what's your first tool that you take, if there's one, out of your toolbox and apply? What do you look at a chart through? What filter? Give us a little.
I'll start with what's the end in mind? What's the goal?
Good.
The goal is ultimately for this person to have clarity and feel encouraged, even if they're dealing with difficult circumstances, especially if they're dealing with difficult circumstances. If, Pluto's on their sun and I can recognize Pluto's on their sun, I'm going to be very careful not to go like, oh, yeah, oh shit, because that instills fear. Yeah. So what I want them to recognize is that they're in a cosmos that loves them, that wants them around, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. Right. So it is to recognize that doesn't mean then you won't have hardship, you won't have tribulations, but to understand where you may have a tribulation and where you may also have testimony of a treasure you're not paying attention to. So it's also to kind of bring to their attention the tribulation and the treasure, so that they have clarity related to where they can move. So it's not Pollyannish to say like, oh, this is that. In terms of the astrology, where I focus, if it's, someone thrusting a chart in my face, it's kind of like, okay, sun, moon, rising, right? But what I also pay attention to is I let the chart speak. And so I kind of go, and this is what I teach to my students, what starts speaking to you the loudest, and it could be like you see a Sun Saturn opposition, right? And that becomes, I recently had a client, she didn't have a Sun Saturn, she had a Sun Pluto opposition. And so that spoke to me the loudest related to the chart. I was like, everything gets funneled through the Sun Pluto. Even though I looked at everything else, the cluster planets in terms of a rising sign, these other things, it's kind of understanding and going beyond than just your intents. What does that Sun Pluto really want to do? And I said to her, one of the things we talked about, because she's maybe 2 years shy of her Saturn return. I said, one of the things to evaluate as you get older and you go toward your Saturn return and beyond, even though you enjoy pleasure and having just enough, as you get older, your relationship to control and power likely will change. So you have to start thinking about now, what is your real relationship to control and power? And that may be more about having a lot more autonomy in your life and wanting to be able to steer your life a particular way. So what sets that up for you rather than just allowing things just to happen? Because the more that you allow things just to happen and you kind of go with the flow, you can build up resentment. And your life, you look at 40 and your life is not the way you wanted it to go, but you could have steered it a different way, but you actually made incremental, maybe even smaller choices along the way that allowed you just to kind of have it just however it was served.
Gotcha. Transits, progressions, directions.
What do I use? Yeah, so I'm perfections. I'm Fredaria. I do some zodiacal releasing. Okay, well, I'll go with my main gems. Okay, I'll go back.
But it sounds pretty classical Hellenistic.
It is, but I also my main go-tos, how I look at every chart.
Yeah.
Goes with perfections, secondary progressions, solar returns, and paying attention to the Lord of the Year, and then transits.
Lord of the Year being perfection.
Perfection, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And then that's when I go into Fredaria and zodiacal releasing, mainly from the Lot of Fortune, because most people are like, what's going to happen to me, right? Which is not so much, what can I do? Which is more the Lot of Spirit.
Yeah.
So those are the things I kind of get more into, but yeah, that's kind of
now low on your list.
Directions.
Huh?
And solar directions.
And solar, but now where do transits fall in all of that?
Transits are, and I got cussed out by a student roughly for this. I'd say they're the icing on the cake, right? Right. I think because
I come to this from a slightly different perspective. And again, I mean, one of the things that I teach my students is that whatever your teacher uses try it, but try everything else too. And if it works for you, then use it, because different tools work and resound for different people.
Absolutely.
And
I teach the same thing.
all the tools that you mentioned are all in the toolbox. But my go-to, typically in a first session with a client, is transits, because from my point of view, I'm not saying that this is the point of view, they seem to resonate the instantaneous. I'm an Aries. They seem to resonate in the moment the strongest. So
Yeah.
that's where I go.
And I mean, it's not like I nix that, because like I just mentioned, like if a client is going through Pluto on their sun, I'm gonna see that.
Right. It's almost like it's so ubiquitous. It's like where does that fit into, so to speak?
Yeah, and the question becomes with transits is like, especially because there's a whole conversation one could have, because I started off modern, then moved classical, and now I'm kind of a hybrid.
Yeah.
My issue with transits can be that, sometimes we can make so much of a big deal of a certain transit without recognizing that it's situated within a larger framework, whether you're saying a time lord or whatever. Yeah. So I had a friend, just as an example, who's into astrology and knows some astrology. When Saturn was going over my sun, I hacked that Saturn transit by getting black kettlebells and working with them and lifting weights, right? That was kind of my way of honoring it. And he would write me nearly every other day, "Did Saturn kill you yet?" Right?
Great friend.
Well, he's a great friend. I mean, we have a great sense of humor, right?
Yeah.
But he's kind of like, he was thinking more so about the transit having more authority in my life rather than having a relationship to the transit.
Right, sure. And last question on this little run is, early in our discussion, you threw out in one quick sentence quadrant houses, whole sign houses, and equal houses. What's Sam's favorite? What do you use, when, why, and give us a flavor of that.
For natal charts, I use whole sign houses mainly. When I need to do interrogational work, which is more related to horary or electional, I need those cusps. So I've been using Regiomontanus. I have used Placidus. I may go back to Placidus. That's a longer conversation. But I also, what's interesting, when I'm stargazing, I use Campanus, right? Because then it looks like it does somewhat in the sky.
Yeah.
So I get more of the flavor. So in my regular day-to-day work, I use whole sign, but I am not a whole sign purist.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the record, obviously, when I'm doing research and writing dailies or whatever, whole sign is the only way to go there. And I think when I look at a chart, I think whole signs, but I calculate charts using Coke for as stupid a reason as anybody's reason for using any house signs. Because one of my little axioms is that if any one system worked, there wouldn't be some 20 or 30 of them in widespread use. But I use Coke because it's the most modern, and I'm a modernist. I mean, it's a dumb reason. I think that what I ultimately believe is that putting too much weight on house cusps can be a mistake. It can lead us into that trap of thinking that we know more than we do. But I find more and more people going back to the 17th century Regiomontanus, Marinus. That there seems to be a run of people who have moved from either a Coke or Placidus, Porphyry, Campanus back to Regiomontanus. I find that interesting. So thank you for sharing that, and I'll put you in the Regio club, of which it seems to me growing. I used to think that what house cusp system someone used basically defined their tribe, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean that do you come from?
Oh no, I've said the same thing.
When I come from a Jeff Green tribe and use Porphyry, or a Lee Lehman, using Marinus or Regiomontanus.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It is your tribe. I mean, I even said it in a recent talk. I gave a talk on house divisions for WUSA and the Washington State Astrological Association. And one of the things I said is that one of the reasons why I also use Reggio is that when I talk to other horary astrologers, we're using the same baseline of reference when we talk about the chart, rather than be like, oh, this is in Placidus, I didn't know, right? They, don't have to worry that. But it also depends on who you're talking to. Like if you're a Brit, you might use equal houses. If you're a Brit who from the 70s or 80s, right? More so, you might have used Placidus. When I look at their books, they use more Placidus. Now it's more Reggio.
Yeah. Interesting.
So just depends on who you're talking to when.
Yeah. So cool. All of this. Cool. We could talk for a long time. It's great to hang out with you again. I appreciate you. I appreciate your work. I remember the first time I met you. And actually, I say I remember it. I don't remember. I think it was pre-Norwalk. I think it was somewhere else. I don't remember where. But all I can say is it was probably 10 years ago or more. I don't know how long.
Probably more. Yeah.
And all I can say is that you've grown from what I saw as, as a little kid who seemed really smart to an old wise guy. What? like a wine that's aged properly. So it's good to see you around and see you showing up again and again doing good stuff. I appreciate you, and it's great to have this time to hang out with you. By the way, where can people get a hold of you? I will publish this and I'll put this down here as a link for people. Where do you, assuming that you want anyone to find you ever?
I do. So they can find me at unlockastrology.com. Unlock Astrology.
Do it one more time.
Unlockastrology.com is my website. And then on Twitter, it's Unlock Astrology is my handle now. And then on Instagram, it's S as in Sam, F as in Fred, Reynolds, SF Reynolds, all one word. And then if they want to email me, unlockastrology@gmail.com.
Got it. And so we'll get those out to everybody here also, and I'll put those in the YouTube description so people have that information. Sam, it's great to see you. Congratulations on your graduation of moving away from New York. I've always said that New York City is an intelligence test. When you pass, you get to leave. So
I survived. Yeah, that's interesting.
You survived, you've passed, and I can't wait to see you somewhere again, here, there, anywhere, as assuming that reality has survived this pandemic that we've been through. So good to see you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.